In January 2011, the fuel distributor Petrolimex and the flag carrier Vietnam Airlines actually announced plans to complete their part initial public offerings by the end of 2011 and 2012 respectively. And if that sort of IPO progress according to plan, then probably other SOEs in Vietnam, relatively well-run and large SOEs, may follow. Do you think that's something of positive development in Vietnam moving forward?
Again, if they are forced to compete with other companies in their respective sectors, then yes. If they're just doing it to raise money, then no.
In 2007, there was a corporation called SCIC, which is a state capital investment corporation established in Vietnam. What is your point of view about this particular corporation? What is its role, and how have you seen this particular corporation affected the equitization process in Vietnam?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. It sort of follows from the Temasek model in Singapore, which is the attempt to centralize control over the state's assets, to manage it more as a portfolio rather than as a group of unrelated companies that are essentially managed by different institutions. It's an attempt to reduce the level of fragmentation, to achieve some more coordination in the management of state assets. The problem with it is, like many things, in the implementation. And those other institutions that control these assets in Vietnam didn't really want to go along with that plan. So they weren't willing to surrender the assets to SCIC. So SCIC didn't have the authority, didn't have the power to force them to do it. And as a result, the system really didn't become less fragmented at all. And SCIC didn't really achieve coordination over state assets.
Moving forward into the future, do you think SCIC will be changed somehow?
I think it'd probably be a useful thing. I think it'd be a good thing, but I can't really see it happening.
Jonathan, in one of your articles that you wrote in 2009 in one of the economic bulletins, you mentioned a very worrying trend of large SOEs of Vietnam moving into the financial sector. So companies like PetroVietnam or EVN or FPT or Vinashin. How have you seen that trend affected Vietnam in the last 2 years? And how do you see that going to affect Vietnam in the future?
Well, I think we saw, during the boom, during the period when both the property sector and the financial sectors were booming. And part of that was all of the foreign capital that was flooding in 2006, 2007. There was a huge finance boom and a huge property boom. And the SOEs, having access to capital and having access to land, did what you would expect them to do, which is to try to capitalize on those assets. Because that's where a lot of the growth was coming in Vietnam. It was in
and moving away from their core business.
And moving away from their core business where they weren't making as much money as they wanted to, or which they were hemmed in by government pricing regulations, or they were hemmed in by other institutional factors. They wanted to move into areas where they could make pure profits, and that was in finance and properties. So there was a mass movement into finance and properties among the SOEs, which set up a lot of subsidiaries, a lot of child companies, a lot of grandchild companies, some of which, virtually all of which are equitized joint stock companies that are partially owned by the parent company. And that was a great way to make money for a few years, particularly during the boom. So the SOEs moved a lot of capital and put a lot of land into these projects. The problem with it is if they're all doing the same thing at the same time, then eventually the bubble bursts and you wind up with what we have now, which is a finance sector that where we have too many banks, and some of them are not doing particularly well, and we have too many property development projects, some of which are not doing very well. Meanwhile, there was underinvestment in some areas in their core businesses. They were not necessarily underinvestment, but certainly not very good management of their core businesses.
Is that why we've got the Venetian case in Vietnam with $4 billion in debt?
And that's one of the reasons why we have the Venetian problem, which is that Venetian was given access to a lot of very cheap capital and told to, all right, now here's the deal. You export ships and we will give you all of this cheap capital. Venetian was pretty much aware that there wasn't a lot of money to be made in ships. I mean, the only reason they could get those contracts is by selling those ships very cheaply. So they tried to make money doing other things, and they wound up with 450 subsidiaries before they collapsed, and 20 joint ventures and a number of other businesses alongside those companies.
I read an article about Venetian on Vietnam News earlier this year, and the headline says, Venetian collapse gives state a lesson. Now, Vietnam News is the official English language mouthpiece of the government. So it is coming from the government. What do you think the government would do after such a lesson is learned?
Well, I hope the lesson is learned, and the lesson is that if you want to run large companies profitably, you can't do it on the basis of these deals in which you provide subsidized inputs in exchange, for meeting government targets. If you want to run these companies and keep them in the state sector, and there's no reason why they can't be in the state sector, but they have to run like real companies. They have to compete. They have to be transparent. They have to be accountable to their largest shareholder, which is the state, which is essentially the Vietnamese public. And that's the only way to do it.
Last question. You happy with that? For the investing community out there, internationally, who has an eye on investing into SOEs in Vietnam, what would be your key message to them on this show?
I think companies that I've talked to are very wary of valuations in the state sector. They think that many of the valuations are unrealistic, given the underlying assets of the companies and some of the legacy costs in these companies. So I think, essentially foreign investors in a wide range of sectors will be looking to participate in Vietnam, both by setting up new companies and by partnering with state companies or buying parts of state companies. I think the process would be a lot easier if the valuations were more realistic.
Do you expect it to be more realistic in the future?
It's possible. I mean, I think certainly the government understands that running persistently high fiscal deficits is a problem. It's a problem for macroeconomic stability. It's a problem in terms of getting some control over inflation. The fiscal deficit needs to come down. And one way to do that is to raise money by selling assets. And, by the government's own estimate, the SOEs control about 70% of fixed assets in Vietnam. So there's a lot of money involved.
Do you think the starting point of Vietnam Airlines and Petrolimex being equitized at the moment is signifying something like that happening in Vietnam? Selling state assets?
Yeah, I think it suggests that the model that the government wants to pursue is the idea of selling a strategic, selling a part of these companies to a strategic investor who will bring money, so they get a big chunk of money, and will also bring some expertise into the business. I'm not convinced by that model. I think alongside of that, you need competition. One model that might work is, all right, rather than IPO part of Vietnam Airlines in Vietnam, why not sell part of Vietnam Airlines on the Singapore exchange? And then in doing so, you have to follow Singapore's rules, accounting rules. And in doing so, you impose some discipline on Vietnam Airlines. And then in addition to that, you need to allow some other players in Vietnam to compete with Vietnam Airlines to make it a better airline. And in fact, I think Vietnam Airlines would do quite well. I think that they've got a very strong basis on which to compete, for the domestic market share. But at the moment, they don't really have serious competition.
What's your level of optimism about that happening in Vietnam?
I think eventually it will happen. I think it's just a question of time? Are we going to play through a few more iterations of different strategies? But I think in the end, that's the strategy that will be tried, and I hope that it will be successful and will lead the government to continue along the same lines.
Okay, thank you very much for being on the show with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
State-owned enterprises will no doubt continue to be the dominant force behind Vietnam's economy. However, we do see cautious movement from the government towards equitizing large and well-run SOEs in the future. With gradualism at the core of this country's planning system, we're not likely to see complete takeovers or less control of the government in the sector. The key message sent by our guest speaker today is one that perhaps you can take into serious consideration moving forward. Well, nothing in life is permanent, and we are coming to the end of yet another show. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have questions for the show or for Jonathan, please send them to fei@insidevietnam.com.vn. For past episodes and show updates, please visit Inside Vietnam on WordPress, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. My name is Phi Nguyen, and I'm your host on Inside Vietnam. Having just returned from a meditation trip up in the mountain in Chiang Mai, let me wish you all internal happiness and clarity in your future investment decisions, despite any turmoil in today's business world.